Tonight, we return to the ruins of why Plato's warning still haunts us today. The world is quiet, but not still. In the depths of thought, beneath the surface of history and the shimmer of myth, there is a voice, ancient, deliberate, and unwavering. It belongs to Plato, a man not just of logic, but of longing. A philosopher haunted not by fantasy, but by foresight. He writes with a hand steady from discipline, yet heavy with grief. And as he breathes life into his most mysterious tale, the tale of Atlantis, it is not the city he mourns, but the cycle. The cycle of rise and ruin, of wisdom remembered, then drowned. So, before you drift too far into the silence, listen. Let the dust settle, the echoes rise, and the forgotten throne speak once more. He sits in the shaded portico of the academy, parchment rolled out before him, his thoughts reaching far beyond the olive groves of Athens. Plato doesn't merely write, he records. He claims nothing from invention. What he shares, he says, was passed down through Solon, from Egyptian priests, from older mouths whose teeth had long since turned to sand. He speaks of a great island empire, Atlantis, that once flourished beyond the pillars of Heracles, a land rich in beauty, wealth, and power, a land granted by the gods. But as generations passed, the divine spark faded. They lost their way. Pride overcame purpose, and so, in a single night and day, Atlantis was swallowed by the sea. One historical fact remains. Plato first introduces Atlantis in Timaeus and expands the myth in Critias. He claims it was a true story, though many scholars believe it allegorical, a moral mirror more than a literal memory. Still, the myth endures, not because we believe in the ruins, but because we recognize the pattern. In Atlantis, Plato encodes his warning, not just to states, but to souls, that even the brightest civilizations can fall, not from war, but from forgetting what made them worthy. He weaves the fall of Atlantis into a tapestry of moral philosophy, not as a tale of ancient gods, but as a lesson in political decay. The Atlanteans, he says, were once divine in spirit, moderate in desire. But slowly, their divine nature was overrun by the mortal. The flesh overtook the soul. And when that balance tipped, nature itself responded. A fringe belief whispers another possibility, that Plato's Atlantis was a coded remembrance of an actual cataclysm, perhaps the Thera eruption or a lost culture older than Egypt, swallowed in the younger Dryas floods. But even these voices admit, the myth lives not by stone, but by symbol. What makes it eternal is what it warns. The warning is not about gods punishing sin. It's about what happens when a civilization forgets itself, when progress outruns virtue, when knowledge blooms but wisdom withers, when voices grow louder but none speak truth. Plato fears this because he sees it, even in his own Athens, a city brilliant and chaotic, proud of its freedom but prey to demagogues. He watches as philosophers are mocked, artists are exiled, and his teacher, Socrates, is put to death by popular vote. This is not a tale from the distant past. For Plato, it is current and urgent. The city is loud, the people restless, and the shadows on the cave wall are mistaken for reality. So he builds a myth, a city that rose too high, a people that forgot the rhythm of the soul, and a sea that came not as punishment, but as silence, to wash away the noise. Historians still debate, was Plato warning of Athens, of empire itself? Or was he crafting a timeless parable, a ghost story meant to echo in every future throne room? You can feel the question linger in the air of the academy. His students sit cross-legged beneath the fig trees, scrolls in hand, watching the old man with wary awe. They don't know that the city will soon shift again, that power will centralize, that another philosopher will try to make Plato's dreams real, and fail. For now, they only listen. And in the quiet, Plato returns to the page. He writes not with fear, but with clarity, because he has seen what few are willing to face. That brilliance alone does not save a people. That reason, without virtue, becomes cruelty. And that even truth, if ignored, will sink. Atlantis is gone, whether it ever stood in stone or not. But the deeper truth is this. It did not need to exist, for the fall was not physical. It was moral. It always is. And so the warning begins, etched not in marble, but in myth, preserved not in ruins, but in memory. And it has waited. For us, the Atlanteans, Plato tells us, once lived close to the gods, their hearts pulsed with divine harmony. Justice was not enforced, it was embodied. They shared a sense of purpose deeper than law, older than tradition. They did not hoard, they honored. They did not conquer, they cultivated. But such balance, like all delicate things, is not permanent. Time passes. Generations forget. The Atlanteans begin to desire more than they need. Beauty becomes excess. Wisdom becomes strategy. Power becomes currency. They dig deeper into the earth, extracting its veins of silver and gold, polishing their cities into temples of pride. And then slowly something shifts. The light in their eyes dims. Their prayers become performances, their towers taller than need, their hearts quieter than ambition. And in this moment, not when war erupts, not when ships launch, not when temples fall, but here in the soul's turning, the golden age ends. Plato describes Atlantis as a vast symmetrical land, ringed with concentric canals, mountains rich in ore, plains brimming with elephants and wild bulls, and cities where marble flowed like water. Their architecture reflected cosmic geometry. Their laws mirrored celestial order. Even the gods, it seemed, once walked among them. And yet, this empire, grand beyond reckoning, drowns not in blood, but in its own reflection. One historical fact stands here. Plato places the fall of Atlantis roughly 9,000 years before Solon, around 11,000 years before his own time. No known empire from that era matches the scale, yet we now know that human civilization may be far older than once believed. Excavations at places like Göbekli Tepe challenge the timeline. A fringe belief holds that Atlantis was not just a continent, but a state of consciousness, a forgotten era when humanity lived in vibrational resonance with nature and spirit. The collapse, then, wasn't merely geographical, but dimensional. Whether stone or symbol, the message is clear. Atlantis collapses from within. Plato's narration doesn't waste time on battle scenes or enemy invasions. The real destruction happens long before the flood. It begins when virtue becomes vanity, when the sacred is sold for spectacle. One day the gods convene. They see what has become of their favored children. They feel the dissonance in the soul of Atlantis. And in a moment, not out of rage but perhaps sorrow, they loosen the bindings. Earth shakes, the sea rushes inward, and the city is gone. But Plato doesn't describe it with triumph. There is no joy in the gods' judgment. There is no celebration in the moral. It is written with weight, with regret, with that soft, unbearable truth that those who once walked with gods can fall like stones. Historians still debate whether Plato invented this entirely. Many point to its suspicious structure, how it mirrors the Republic, how it illustrates decay so neatly. Too neat, perhaps. But others pause at the consistency of detail, the complexity of the geography, the tone of memory more than imagination. Why would a philosopher lie so precisely? Maybe he didn't, maybe he dreamed it, or maybe, just maybe, he remembered. And yet, the point was never the coordinates, never the treasure, never the proof. The point was the pattern. Atlantis was not a singular warning. It was a mirror held up to all great powers, all nations swollen with wealth, confidence, and control. Plato saw the shadows creeping into his own Athens, the same shadows that dimmed Atlantis before the sea. And so he wrote not as a chronicler, but as a guardian. Someone who saw the cycle and hoped, perhaps foolishly, that naming it might slow it. You can almost hear the scratching of his stylus across the wax, the warm wind carrying the smell of cedar and wine, the way his eyes narrow not with anger, but with a kind of worn-out knowing. Atlantis was once a land of gold, but gold when hoarded always turns heavy. It was once a land of harmony, but harmony when unguarded always dissolves into noise. And so it fell, not because it was evil, but because it forgot to be good, and the ocean, impartial, eternal, simply returned it to silence. Plato does not let Atlantis dominate the spotlight. No. He casts another city on the stage, a city born not of excess but of restraint, a place of virtue, simplicity, and courage. He names it Athens, but not the Athens of marble and agora, not the one crumbling beneath political intrigue and war with Sparta. No, this Athens is ancient, mythic, almost ghost-like, a city lost even to memory in Plato's own day. He describes a civilization older than Atlantis, Wise, modest, and profoundly just, its warriors fight not for conquest, but for balance. Its citizens do not clamor for power, but for clarity. And when Atlantis sets out to dominate the known world, this ancient Athens stands alone in defiance. A single city against an empire. No allies, no gods descending in fire, just a people unwilling to kneel. One historical fact hides in Plato's subtext. The Athenian self-image of his time was deeply tied to their identity as defenders of democracy and reason, especially in contrast to the opulence of Persia or the brutality of Sparta. His Mythic Athens is an idealized echo of what Athens could be, but often failed to become. Plato's fringe-minded readers, however, have another theory, that this ancient Athens wasn't myth at all, but a memory of a forgotten pre-Ice Age civilization, perhaps one that built with stone, carved with precision, and vanished beneath floods. Some even claim it might be connected to other lost places, Lemuria, Mu, or the mysterious ruins found beneath Lake Titicaca. But Plato's narrative is not about proving Athens existed, it's about why he chose to include it. He sets up a moral contrast. Atlantis, swollen with riches and divine favor, collapses. But Athens, humble and righteous, survives, until it doesn't. For in his unfinished dialogue Critias, Plato leaves us hanging. Athens, like Atlantis, eventually disappears, not in war, but in silence. Its story stops mid-sentence, as if the dream was too fragile, or perhaps as if the gods grew tired of even the righteous. Historians still argue whether Plato intended to finish the tale. Some suggest he left it unfinished to emphasize the fragility of virtue, that even the just city cannot escape the tides of time. Others wonder if it was a deliberate void, a way to reflect our own world, always incomplete, always trembling. And so the silence between Athens and Atlantis becomes its own message. Athens resists Atlantis, not with bigger armies but with cleaner hearts. But resistance alone is not enough. Both fall, one to pride, one perhaps to neglect. You feel it, don't you? The ache behind the allegory. Plato is not pointing fingers. He's holding up a mirror. He's showing us two sides of a single fate. What power does to those who chase it, and what memory does to those who try to hold it. Atlantis is spectacle, Athens is structure. Atlantis burns fast, Athens fades slowly. And in between, there is us, standing at the crossroads again and again. He walks the length of the Academy's garden, sandals brushing dust, eyes fixed on something far past the olive trees. His students wait for him to explain the contradiction. If Athens was so good, why did it vanish too? He doesn't answer. Instead, he lets the silence hang. Sometimes the warning is not in the words, but in the absence of them. Because even the best cities fall when their ideals become memory rather than muscle. Even the bravest people lose their way when they forget why they stood. And even the wisest warnings are ignored when we crave comfort more than truth. Plato leaves the lesson unfinished, not because he didn't know the ending, but because we are still writing it. In Plato's dialogues, Atlantis begins as a utopia, a dream cradled by Poseidon himself, sculpted in perfect circles of land and sea. 10 kings rule 10 districts in harmony. Laws are engraved on orichalcum, a mythical metal said to glow with inner fire. Justice flows like the rivers. No poverty, no unrest, just order, balance, glory. But dreams, no matter how symmetrical, do not hold their shape forever. Plato writes of an age when kings obey divine law, but over time, their lineage becomes thinned by mortals. The divine spark fades, their decisions become selfish, their palaces grow taller, their voices louder. And soon, the harmony that once defined Atlantis collapses into discord. It's not chaos that breaks a civilization, it's imbalance. One historical fact Plato folds into his myth. The idea of the just ruler and the role of law comes from his obsession with nomoi, the belief that without moral law, even the strongest government collapses into tyranny. Atlantis becomes a cautionary tale not of violence, but of slow erosion. A fringe belief claims the Atlanteans had access to anti-gravity energy. Some even link this to the legends of Vimanas in India or the mysterious Baalbek stone platforms. They imagine a world where ancient beings, whether human or not, engineered the impossible, then vanished, leaving myths behind. But whether powered by orichalcum or ethics, Plato's Atlantis breaks for a reason. It forgets its foundation. You see, order is not sustained by wealth, not by force, not even by law alone. Order comes from remembering who you are and why you built in the first place. And Atlantis forgets. The kings become arrogant. They seek to conquer beyond their shores. Their once sacred capital becomes a monument to vanity. Temples become fortresses. Celebration replaces reflection. And in the divine realms, the gods watch. Plato writes that Zeus, king of all, gathers the gods and speaks of judgment, but the speech itself is never written. The manuscript ends there. His words are swallowed by time, or perhaps by choice. Historians still debate why Plato left Zeus's speech unwritten. Was it intentional? A challenge to the reader to imagine divine justice? Or was it lost in a forgotten scroll, a broken wax tablet on some dusty shelf? But in that silence, we hear everything. Because what can the gods say to those who no longer listen? What can justice do in a world that redefines it with every whim? Atlantis becomes its own storm, not from enemies, from within. The waters that rise are not angry, they're inevitable. The city that once shimmered with order now trembles under its own design. The weight of its towers, the greed in its roots, the emptiness of its rituals. And on one final day, the ocean walks in, calm, final, merciless. It doesn't rage, it reclaims. And still, Plato's message isn't one of wrath, it's one of remembering. Because every civilization builds its own Atlantis, not out there in the sea, but here, in the heart, in the systems we design, in the choices we normalize, in the comforts we mistake for truths. Atlantis rises when we're in tune. Atlantis falls when we forget the music. And so the rings of land and sea vanish beneath the waves, not as punishment, but as prophecy. Plato rarely screams. He prefers to whisper warnings that echo through time. But in the Republic, he draws a sharp, deliberate line, a trajectory every government follows when it loses its moral compass. It begins with aristocracy, then decays into timocracy, oligarchy, democracy, and finally, tyranny. And nestled in that transition, from freedom to chains, is a haunting truth. The tyrant is born from the crowd. Plato does not blame some shadowed villain, some foreign enemy or secret cabal. No, he blames us, the citizens, the audience, the believers. We who grow bored of reason, impatient with virtue, hungry for spectacle. He sketches a society where desires multiply, where discipline fades, and where leaders no longer rise through wisdom, but through performance. Sound familiar? One historical fact. During Plato's life, Athens saw the trial and execution of Socrates, his mentor, condemned by a democratic vote. This marked a spiritual wound in Plato. Democracy, once sacred, had murdered philosophy. From that moment, his writing turned darker, sharper. A fringe interpretation of the Republic suggests Plato wasn't just theorizing. He was documenting a real descent, perhaps even inspired by secret initiations into Egyptian or Orphic mysteries, where initiates were shown visions of future ages. Some even believe Plato foresaw the fall of modern civilization, that the tyrant soul he describes is not a metaphor, but a psychic archetype that rises cyclically through time. But let's stay with the image. A free people begin to worship their own freedom. Every voice must be equal, every desire valid. Rules soften, boundaries blur. The wise are mocked for speaking slowly. The loud are praised for saying what we want to hear. And then, from this whirlwind of choice, one voice rises. Not because it is wise, not because it is kind, but because it promises to make the chaos stop. Plato shows how the tyrant begins as a protector, a man of the people, a friend of the majority. He speaks with warmth, walks among the crowd, tells them what they crave. You deserve more. You are owed. You are right. He flatters their frustration until it hardens into loyalty. And then, piece by piece, freedom becomes fear. The crowd, once jubilant, becomes dependent. They trade thought for certainty. They silence dissent. They become exactly what they once opposed. Historians still wrestle with Plato's tone. Was he warning against democracy entirely, or only against its corrupted form, when it loses discipline, when it forgets education, when it favors feeling over structure? Some claim he saw no redemption in democracy. Others say he wept for its lost potential. But either way, the arc is clear. The tyrant does not arrive in darkness. He arrives in daylight, welcomed, not resisted. And Plato draws this warning not with cynicism, but with grief. He's not laughing from a marble bench. He's pacing, watching, remembering what happened to Socrates, and realizing it will happen again. Because when a people forget how to think, they will beg someone to think for them, and that someone will eventually silence everyone else. Atlantis fell because it grew too proud. Athens fell because it grew too certain. And the tyrant, born from both, rises because we no longer ask why, only when. Plato doesn't just study power, he studies its shadow, and nowhere is that shadow darker than in the soul of the tyrant. He imagines this man in the Republic, not a monster, not a demon, but something far more unsettling. An ordinary person, shaped by craving, twisted by desire. Someone who begins life wanting only to be free, but ends up enslaving everything around him, including himself. The tyrant, Plato says, is not born evil, he is born unrestrained. His dreams overflow with appetites. He feasts on illusion. He cannot delay pleasure, cannot tolerate limits. He builds his identity like a fortress, layer after layer of power, money, admiration, hoping it will quiet the storm within. But the storm only grows. Plato calls him the most miserable man of all. And yet this man rules empires. One historical fact: the Greek world, in Plato's day, had witnessed the rise of Dionysius III of Syracuse, a brutal ruler whom Plato personally confronted. The two clashed when Plato attempted to guide him with philosophy. The result? Plato was insulted, imprisoned, and eventually sold into slavery. Yes, the greatest philosopher of Athens was once owned. This bitter humiliation stains every page of his writing on tyranny. A fringe belief traces this archetype deeper. Some mystics claim the tyrant's soul is not just a psychological type, but an ancient spiritual corruption, a parasite of power that moves through rulers across ages. They whisper of fallen angels, egregores, or even interdimensional entities feeding on fear. Atlantis, they say, was just the first host. But whether metaphor or myth, the tyrant always follows a pattern. He does not share. He does not listen. He does not weep. His palace becomes a cage. His guards become spies. His thoughts grow suspicious, then paranoid, then utterly alone. Every enemy is invented. Every ally becomes a threat. And still, he claims to protect the people. Plato says this man, though he commands armies, cannot command himself. Historians still debate whether Plato saw this type in every ruler or just the corrupted few. Was he warning of a universal fate or only the extremes? But the image persists. The man with absolute power is the man furthest from peace. And the tragedy? He believes he is safe, even as his empire cracks, even as his soul withers, even as the sea rises. And so, in the myth of Atlantis, Plato plants a seed. What if the island didn't fall because of invasion or gods or weather? What if it fell because of one man's unhealed hunger? Not a monster, a mirror. You imagine this man standing on the highest tower in Atlantis, looking out over rings of shining water and stone. He sees the temples, the fountains, the ships returning with tribute. But he does not feel joy. He feels lack. More is never enough. And when the ocean begins to pull at the roots of the city, he does not run. He denies. He clenches his fists and dares the gods to strike him. And they do, not out of fury, but because he leaves them no choice. This is the heart of Plato's warning. Not that tyrants are powerful, but that we make them so when we forget to govern ourselves, when we forget to doubt, to question, to wait. Atlantis was a paradise until it believed paradise could be controlled. And the tyrant, its final king, stood on sacred ground and claimed it as his. That's when the sky cracked. That's when the water came. But Plato, ever the philosopher, doesn't just warn through kings and cities. He warns through the soul itself. To him, every human being contains a city within, a miniature polis of reason, spirit, and desire. When these parts live in harmony, the person thrives. When they rebel, the self collapses. And so, the fall of Atlantis is not just about a continent. It's about you. One historical fact. In the Republic, Plato presents the tripartite soul, the rational, the spirited, and the appetitive. He parallels these to the ideal city: rulers, reason; warriors, spirit; and producers, desire. A just soul, like a just city, keeps each part in its place. But what happens when the desiring part overpowers the rest? Atlantis happens. Plato constructs his allegory carefully. A civilization born of divine order, slowly overrun by unchecked appetite. What was once sacred becomes indulgent. What was once disciplined becomes decadent. Even the temples, once places of reverence, become trophies. And just as the soul, corrupted by desire, loses its balance, so does the island. A fringe belief goes further. Some esoteric thinkers claim Atlantis was not merely a place, but a state of consciousness, a golden age of inner clarity that humanity lost when it turned outward, toward material conquest, scientific dominance, egoic separation. The deluge, they say, was not water. It was amnesia. Atlantis didn't sink. We fell asleep. And yet, Plato whispers of hope. If the soul can fall, it can also rise. If the city within is broken, it can be rebuilt, stone by stone, choice by choice. But it starts with knowing what part is speaking. Is it your reason, calm, patient, guiding? Or your spirit, bold, fierce, protective? Or your desire, urgent, hungry, whispering more? Plato believes the wise man listens first. And in that listening, civilization is reborn. Historians still ponder how literally Plato intended these soul parallels. Was it metaphorical psychology, a spiritual blueprint, or an ethical framework? Regardless, the symmetry between inner and outer collapse remains haunting. Atlantis is not just a lost island. It's a warning written on the walls of your mind. When you chase without pausing, when you speak without reflecting, when you build without anchoring to purpose, you echo the Atlanteans, and the water waits. Imagine now the last priest of Atlantis descending into a sacred chamber deep below the city. He lights a single flame, kneels before the last scrolls, and weeps not for the buildings above, but for the silence below. He had seen it coming. The pride, the noise, the endless need, and still no one listened. Just like the soul, he thinks. You can scream at it to change, but until it chooses to remember, to return to center, it stays broken. And that's the real tragedy. Not that Atlantis sank, but that it didn't have to. There's a hum beneath Plato's myth, not thunder, not waves, but something mathematical. Atlantis, he writes, is a marvel of geometry, concentric circles of land and water, perfectly measured, temples in gold and silver, bridges carved with precision, streets aligned with celestial movements. This isn't the chaos of nature, it's the fingerprint of design. Plato's Atlantis is not just a city, it's a machine. One historical fact: ancient Greek thinkers, including Pythagoras and Plato himself, believed in the harmony of the spheres, the idea that mathematics governed not just music and architecture, but the cosmos itself. Numbers weren't just tools, they were sacred truths. So it makes sense that Atlantis would mirror the heavens, that its layout would reflect the divine order. But then, it becomes clear. This was no ordinary city. It was a technology. A fringe theory, long dismissed by mainstream historians, proposes that Atlantis was a power center, not symbolic but literal. That the rings of water channeled magnetic energy, creating a kind of ancient Tesla coil. The temples weren't for worship but for resonance, tuning forks, star maps, crystal cores. To believers, Atlantis didn't fall, it overloaded. Too much energy, too little reverence. The system broke. And maybe that's Plato's quietest warning. When we treat power as a right, not a ritual, we break what we do not understand. Historians still argue whether Plato borrowed these ideas from Egyptian priests, as he claimed in Timaeus, or whether they were inventions of his own. The scrolls say he traveled to Heliopolis and learned from ancient sages who guarded memories of pre-flood civilizations. But no one can prove it. Only echoes remain. Still, imagine it. A city alive with sound, stones that sing, towers that pulse, waterways carved with such precision they pull tides in rhythm with the stars. And then, silence. The moment a frequency shifts, the instant harmony gives way to noise. One note too high, one gear turned too far, and the city begins to unravel. You see, even a perfect system becomes a curse when wielded without balance. The same formula that builds a world can unmake it. So Plato doesn't warn against science. He warns against pride in science. He invites us to ask, what are we building now? Skyscrapers that scrape the sky, networks that never sleep, algorithms that predict our desires before we speak. Do we know what these things are doing? Or do we assume, like Atlanteans, that if it functions, it must be safe? Atlantis didn't fall because it failed. It fell because it succeeded. Too well, too fast, too far beyond what its soul could carry. And so the rings sink. The metals cool. The resonance fades until only myth remains. And somewhere in the void between memory and invention, Plato sits with his stylus, sketching a city that never was, or one we've simply forgotten how to build again. Even as the waters rise, Plato leaves us a riddle. He says Atlantis once waged war against the known world, that its navy stretched across the pillars of Heracles, that its ambition grew teeth. But it was stopped, not by gods, not by storms, by Athens. Not the Athens of his time, fractured, tired, grieving, but an older, purer Athens, a city of virtue, courage, and restraint, the kind of place where leaders are philosophers and soldiers defend not conquest, but balance. It's a strange twist. Atlantis, the grand empire of rings and riches, falls to a city made of simpler stone. It begs the question, what kind of strength truly endures? One historical fact: Plato sets the Atlantis myth 9,000 years before Solon's visit to Egypt, placing the war in a timeline that predates all recorded Greek history. Scholars argue whether he meant it literally or as an allegorical contrast between excess and moderation. But fringe theorists find something more. They say Plato is hiding a cycle, that every few thousand years a great civilization rises, overreaches, and collapses. Atlantis was not the first, nor will it be the last. The real question isn't whether it existed, but whether we're next. And here's the sting. Plato describes Athens not as it was, but as it should be. His perfect republic, his imagined harmony. He draws a mirror not just for Atlantis, but for us. Who are we becoming? Are we the glittering empire, obsessed with more, hungry for dominion? Or the humble polis willing to hold the line? Historians still debate whether Plato invented Atlantis as a cautionary tale to showcase his political ideals, a lost golden age meant to glorify the values of his philosophical city. If so, then Atlantis isn't even the star of the story. We are. And that's what haunts, not the waves, not the myth, but the suspicion that Plato is still watching, still writing, still measuring our world, its empires, its luxuries, its leaders, against the one that sank and the one that stood. You picture him now, alone in a flickering lamplight, eyes fixed on the horizon of thought. He doesn't shout. He doesn't threaten. He simply asks the hardest question: what will you do with power? Because Athens stands only when you choose it. And Atlantis, it waits beneath. In the deepest chambers of Plato's dialogues, there is a whisper about the gods. He doesn't treat them as legends, nor as omnipotent puppeteers. Instead, he describes a divine intelligence, a cosmic craftsman, the demiurge, who shapes the world not with emotion, but with proportion. A being who builds reality like a mathematician, not a monarch. And it is this divine logic that gives rise to Atlantis. In Plato's myth, the gods divide the earth among themselves. Poseidon, lord of the sea, receives the island of Atlantis and falls in love with a mortal woman. From their union, a line of kings is born, 10 brothers who govern in peace, guided by divine essence. But over time, that essence thins. The blood of gods fades into the blood of men, and the order begins to decay. One historical fact: in Timaeus, Plato emphasizes that the universe is structured by order, not chaos. The demiurge creates the cosmos using eternal forms, ideal patterns, shaping the world into something as good as it can be. Atlantis, then, may be seen as a copy of an ideal city, slowly drifting away from its source. A fringe belief goes further. Some claim the gods who gave Atlantis its knowledge were not mythological at all, but ancient extraterrestrials, misunderstood by early humans. The divine technology of Atlantis, they say, came from beyond the stars: crystals, levitation, psychic tools, gifts from Orion or Sirius. But even aliens, it seems, cannot save a people from themselves. Historians still argue whether Plato's gods were religious symbols or philosophical metaphors, stand-ins for natural law, moral order, or the structure of the soul. But in either case, the pattern is clear. Atlantis falls when the divine is forgotten. Poseidon weeps, but he does not intervene, because the laws are already set. The balance must hold, and so the sons of the gods become kings of greed. The temples once filled with prayer now echo with coin and command. and the earth, once in harmony with heaven, begins to tilt. You can feel it, the trembling under the marble, the stillness before the sea stirs, not out of wrath, but out of symmetry. Atlantis becomes too heavy, and the scale shifts. Perhaps this is Plato's most chilling warning. Divinity may give you everything, knowledge, beauty, power, but it will not save you if you abandon the harmony that birthed it. Atlantis had gods in its blood, and still it drowned. What then does that mean for us? We who build towers to the sky, we who summon storms of data and fire and light, we who forget to ask, why are we building at all? Plato's gods do not punish, they simply withdraw. And when they do, the blueprint fades, the music stops, and the city, once divine, returns to dust. Some say it wasn't water that swallowed Atlantis. It was sound. Plato never mentions music in the myth, not directly. But listen closely. The layout of the city, the circles, the symmetry, the crystalline metals, it all hums with a strange kind of silence, like a tuning fork waiting to ring, like an orchestra missing its final note. One historical fact: ancient Greek philosophers, including Pythagoras and later Plato, believed in the music of the spheres, the idea that celestial bodies moved in mathematically perfect harmonies. The same ratios that governed lyres and flutes also governed planets and stars. Harmony wasn't art, it was physics, sacred, structural, eternal. And so what if Atlantis was built to sing? Not metaphorically, literally. Some fringe theories claim that Atlantis used acoustic resonance as technology. Stone chambers designed to amplify frequencies, water tunnels that echoed natural harmonics, crystals charged by the human voice, healing with vibration, levitation through tone, communication without speech. Not magic, not mysticism, just forgotten science. But then comes the silence. Imagine the Atlanteans no longer honoring the tuning of their world, the sacred frequencies lost beneath profit and spectacle. The temples no longer vibrating with intent, but with indulgence, the instruments detuned, and the city, like a great harp, begins to snap. Historians still debate whether any ancient civilization had advanced sound technology. Some point to structures like the Hypogeum in Malta or the Great Pyramid's echo chambers. Others dismiss it all as pseudoscience, but the debate itself is part of the haunting. Because if sound is real, then so is silence. And Plato, in his eerie precision, leaves Atlantis without a final scream. No war, no fire, just gone. As if a switch flipped, as if the cord was broken. And perhaps that's the scariest version of the fall, not one of punishment, but one of disconnection. Atlantis didn't collapse because of a single flaw. It forgot how to listen. To its gods, to its people, to its own heartbeat. And you wonder, are we listening now? Or is our world, buzzing with noise but empty of harmony, already out of tune? Somewhere, beneath the ocean or beneath the ego, Atlantis still vibrates, a faint pulse, a buried note, waiting for someone to tune the world again. The closer you drift to the core of Plato's myth, the colder it gets. Not from ocean water or wind, but from clarity. The kind of chill that comes when a truth sits too still, too ancient, too sharp to touch. Because in the end, Atlantis isn't just a warning about cities or kings or technology. It's a warning about memory. One historical fact: Plato claims the tale of Atlantis was passed down from Egyptian priests to the Greek lawmaker Solon and eventually to him. The story, he says, is ancient, older than Greek culture, preserved in sacred scrolls in the temples of Sai. But this hand-me-down knowledge carries a catch. The Greeks, the priests warned, were children. They remembered only recent floods and fires. They had forgotten the true catastrophes, the cyclical destructions that reset entire epics. And perhaps that forgetfulness is the greater tragedy. Because Atlantis didn't just vanish, it was erased. A fringe belief, echoed in esoteric circles, suggests that the fall of Atlantis involved not only physical destruction, but also a deliberate act of forgetting. That survivors scattered across the globe, embedding fragments of Atlantean wisdom in pyramids, stone circles, and myths, only for future generations to misinterpret or ignore them. If that's true, then the ruins are all around us, not beneath the sea, but hidden in plain sight. Historians still argue whether Plato intended this story to reference a real event, a distant memory of the Thera eruption, a lost culture swept away by rising seas, Or was it a symbolic reset button for his ideal society? But maybe the bigger question is, what else have we forgotten? The principles that held civilizations upright? The rhythms that kept power in check? The stories that reminded us who we are? You picture a lone scribe in ancient Egypt, dipping reed into ink, copying the story for the 1000th time. His hands move carefully. He knows no one will believe it. But he writes anyway, not to preserve history, but to plant a seed, a warning wrapped in myth, a memory buried in metaphor. Because he understands, one day someone will need it. And tonight perhaps that someone is you. Not to rebuild Atlantis, but to remember why it fell. Somewhere between myth and memory stands a door. Plato never opens it fully. He sketches its outline in dialogue, cloaks it in metaphor, and leaves the rest in shadow. But if you peer closely, past the floods and the kings and the circles of land and sea, you'll see what lies behind it. The soul of Atlantis. One historical fact. In the Republic, Plato writes of the tripartite soul, reason, spirit, and appetite. A balanced soul mirrors a just society. The philosopher rules, the warrior defends, the worker serves. When any part oversteps, the whole begins to collapse. Apply that to Atlantis and something startling emerges. Atlantis was not just a city. It was a mirror, an externalization of the soul itself, constructed from harmony, built with divine proportions, governed by a balance of powers, a living metaphor for what we are and what we might become. But the appetite grew, the warriors marched, the reason dimmed, and the mirror cracked. Fringe thinkers suggest that Plato encoded an inner teaching within the myth, that the destruction of Atlantis symbolizes the fall of inner balance, the collapse of consciousness itself into ego, into hunger, into noise. A soul out of tune drowns in its own sea. Historians still debate whether the Republic and Timaeus were meant to be read as companion texts, one mapping the inner world, the other the outer. But it's tempting to see Atlantis not just as a city lost to time, but a warning about ourselves. You walk now in your mind's eye through the ruins, not of temples, but of choices. Stones etched with what could have been humility, wisdom, restraint, and others toppled by excess, pride, greed, disconnection. It isn't ancient marble that makes this myth real. It's the feeling in your chest, that quiet pull. The recognition that you've been here before, not in body, but in mistake. Atlantis is not just the fall of a city. It is the fall of balance. And balance, once broken, does not cry out. It sinks, quietly, completely, until the soul forgets how it once stood tall. But even in the deepest trench, even in the echo chamber of loss, Plato leaves one more possibility. That balance can be remembered. That the soul, like the city, can rise again. But only if it listens. Only if it dares to build not taller, but truer. And now, the storm. Plato gives us no ships, no desperate escape, no panicked cries. He simply writes, "In a single day and night, the island of Atlantis disappeared into the sea." It is surgical, unforgiving, like the sea came not in rage but in verdict. One historical fact, the eruption of Thera around 1600 BCE remains one of the most violent natural disasters in human history. It split an island, triggered tsunamis, and may have played a role in the decline of the Minoan civilization. For some, this is the smoking gun, the real Atlantis buried in volcanic ash. But Plato doesn't speak of fire, he speaks of judgment. He paints a moment when the gods, or perhaps fate itself, simply decide enough. A fringe belief. Some occult traditions say Atlantis had a failsafe, a mechanism of self-destruction built into its core, triggered when imbalance became irreversible. Not punishment, but containment. The fall wasn't done to Atlantis, it was chosen by Atlantis, like a soul shutting itself down before it becomes a monster. Historians still argue whether the day and night is symbolic, a metaphor for sudden collapse, or an echo of solar myths where light vanishes and the world resets. But perhaps it's something even simpler. A reminder that things fall faster than we believe. Empires do not bleed slowly. They vanish. You blink and the temple's gone. The marble washed away. The memory faded. The map blank. Only the weight remains, a pressure you can't explain, like a song you've forgotten but still hum in your sleep. You feel it in our world now. The rush, the hunger, the heat. Skyscrapers clawing upward while rivers dry below. Data stretching into stars while silence spreads between us. warnings wrapped in laughter, wounds framed as progress. And you ask, if Atlantis had a final moment, what was the last thing it saw? A mirror? A mistake? Or the shore slipping away forever? No answer comes. Only water. Only hush. Only the myth waiting for someone, anyone, to hear it before it drowns again. Beneath the surface, nothing moves, not really. The currents sleep, the silt settles. The ruins, if they were there at all, rest in darkness so complete it becomes almost sacred. And still, in this silence, the myth breathes. Plato's warning echoes not through temples or scrolls or thunder. It echoes through us. We keep returning to it, digging, translating, obsessing. Not because we need proof, but because somewhere deep inside we know what it means. One historical fact. Throughout the centuries, explorers have sought Atlantis across 5 continents, from the Azores to Antarctica, from Santorini to the Sahara. Even in the 20th century, thinkers like Ignatius Donnelly revived the tale, linking it to the spread of pyramids and lost wisdom across early human civilizations. But Atlantis remains unfound. And perhaps that's the point. A fringe belief holds that Atlantis exists not in space, but in time, a recurring phase of civilization, a karmic cycle of rise, overreach, collapse. It isn't a place, it's a pattern. Historians still debate whether we ever learn from these cycles, whether the story of Atlantis was a one-time myth or a mirror we refuse to face, century after century. But one thing is certain, the sea is rising again, and the warnings feel louder now, not because they have changed, but because we've grown closer to repeating them. Plato didn't end with fire or punishment or wrath. He ended with absence, with a silence so loud it still rattles through time. He ended with a world that had everything and lost it, not to enemies, but to itself. And so we stand once again at the edge, with marble hearts, with golden towers, with the same fragile choice that Atlantis once faced, to listen, to remember, to realign, or to vanish, beautiful and blind. Let the dust settle. Let the echoes rise, and let the forgotten throne speak once more. Wind down, 300 words. The waves are calm now. Whatever storm once came, whether of water or pride or memory, it is past. All that remains is a gentle hush, like breath over stone, like the slow exhale of a world remembering itself. You feel it, don't you? The ancient rhythm beneath the noise, the story beneath the city, the truth beneath the myth. It lingers in every crumbled ruin and half-told tale. Not shouting, not pleading, just waiting. Waiting for us to listen with something deeper than ears, with the kind of silence that only comes when the lights are low, when the noise of the day is faded, when the soul dares to ask what it has forgotten. You picture the last citizen of Atlantis, not a king, not a priest, but someone like you, staring into the darkening sea, wondering if anyone anywhere will remember. And here you are, remembering, not the names or the stones or the circles, but the lesson. That power without wisdom sinks. That beauty without balance breaks. That memory without meaning fades. But stories? Stories last. Because someone, even thousands of years later, will whisper them back into the world. And now, as your eyes grow heavier, as the tide retreats, as the stars emerge over a sea you've never seen, let that whisper stay with you. Not to frighten, not to mourn, but to remind that you too are a builder of choices, of balance, of your own Atlantis. Sleep well, dream gently, and remember the myth.